Over the past year, national security has remained a top priority for the government, with a renewed focus on strengthening defense operations, enhancing surveillance and supporting crime-fighting efforts across the country. From increased coordination between Defense Force and other security agencies to international partnerships aimed at tackling issues like drug trafficking and illegal arms, there have been several strategic moves to improve the safety and stability of Trinidad and Tobago. We've also seen developments in areas like upgraded radar systems, legislative efforts to address high crime zones, and early progress on the government's broader anti-crime plan. And this morning, as part of our ongoing series examining the current administration's first year in office, we're joined now by the Honourable Minister of Defence, Wayne Sturge, to discuss the work done so far and the challenges faced and the path forward in strengthening national security. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning.
And welcome back to Trinidad and Tobago today. Well, Minister, 1 year ago, you were given the portfolio of defence. Do you remember your first day on the job? What was one of the first priorities that you wanted to address?
Yes, I remember the first day, not much of it. I remember when I got in, I met my colleague Xander shortly after, and we sat down and we had some fruitful discussions because there were some issues we wanted to tackle very early on. And I think the first discussion we had revolved around the proximal causes of crime, violent crime, and what we could do to address that in the short term. So we, in essence, brainstormed because we both came from the criminal justice system, of course. He came from the policing side and I came from the criminal defense. So we had some ideas to address, in particular, the murder rate and home invasions. So we discussed, in essence, the short-term measures we hope to implement in short order. And we also discussed the recent imposition of travel restrictions from the UK, the visa requirement, and we tried to piece together the history, the run-up that led to that decision on the part of the United Kingdom, and what we could do to, in essence, roll it back. Later that day, I recall meeting with Minister Sobers, and that's where we started the ball rolling.
Yeah. Now, how would you describe the past year overall, and what would you consider some of the key highlights during your tenure so far?
Well, highlights, positive meeting Prime Minister Modi was a highlight, but that aside, that's a personal thing. Over the past year, it was definitely challenging. The first thing I had to come to grips with was, coming out of private enterprise where when you want something done, it doesn't take very long to get it done. You simply say the word, shout the order. And it doesn't work that way in the public service. So there's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy, for good reason, of course. So things, it was a bit frustrating at times because you want things done in a certain time frame, and it was very difficult. So that was a challenge. The other thing is we had an unexpected and unprovoked threat from our neighbors next door. So at that point, we had that challenge up until January 3rd this year, of course. And in the in-between, from the issuance of the threat up until the threat was, in essence, neutered or neutralized, we had to put up with in essence, we started, first of all, with an audit of our assets, naval assets, air assets, and other assets. We realized where we were, and from 10 years of decline. I don't know if it was part of a plan or if it was just negligence, but we had to take stock of where we were at that point in time. And immediately we realized that we needed assistance and we had to rely on our most trusted ally. So I mean, they are here and they were following, so we knew what we had to do at that point. What made it exceedingly challenging was certain frontline members of the opposition who, instead of looking at it from a national perspective, sought to make politics out of it and stoke the fires and so on, and chain up the population to, in essence, gas up our neighbors next door. And we also found some challenges, some complicit members in the media, not all of them, who jumped on that train. In the end, we managed to navigate those voters successfully, and all of the hype and scare tactics of the opposition and, as I said, some members of the media. And we've gone past that, and I mean, we're in the clear now.
Now, early in your term, you had raised some concerns about illegal activity within the nation's prisons. Now, how important was that, or tackling that issue as part of your broader crime fighting strategy?
Well, what we did when we discussed, Raja and I, the proximal causes, we basically sought to disaggregate the types of murders. Of course, there will be crimes of passion. You can't do anything about that, or families fighting over land or whatever, disputes. If you can get rid of the targeted assassinations, the gang violence, and the crimes of opportunity, such as murders happening during robberies, you could get murders down to less than 100 a year. So we were able to, in essence, determine how many murders come from the inside, from the intelligence, hits scored from the inside. And we felt that once we were able to, in a sustained way, cut off the communication from those on the inside who were calling the shots and in essence, planning murders from the inside. Once we could deal with that part, we could see a reduction in crime, and we could move towards dealing with the other portions.
Now, you were also a key proponent of the home invasion legislation. There was so much about that on the news, on social media, and it was called the Stand Your Ground as well. Now, why was that measure important from a national security standpoint?
Stand your ground. That was in the context of home invasions, because that was steadily increasing over the last 10 years or so. And quite apart from trying to get the murder rate down, and we did get a 42% reduction, partly because of what I just spoke about, which is cutting off communications with certain elements from the inside. The other thing is we had to look at home invasions because it was prevalent, and the impact it had on law-abiding citizens. Imagine you're unable to defend your family, prevent your wife or your daughters from being subjected to rape and things like that. So we had to, in essence, set up the framework, the legal framework. And there are things in the Stand Your Ground legislation that did not present itself in the common law. Secondly, for those who argued it was a codification, at least we have the benefits of codification so that the public is now aware of what their rights are and how they can act in situations such when there's a home invasion. So the law of self-defense is now clear. What we felt we needed to do was put up the framework, first of all, in advance of the second phase. That's just the first phase. The second phase, of course, is to make it easier for homeowners to get firearms. Now, my own view, it would require legislative change. My own view is that we should adopt the American system. If you own property, you should be entitled as a right to a firearm, except in certain situations. If you are someone who beats your wife and things like that, you shouldn't be entitled to it. Because there's always the risk that you could use it against the people who you are supposed to protect. So my own view is that homeowners should have that right, and the right to carry, as they call it in the United States, where you can leave home with your firearm, the FUL part of it, that can remain with the Commissioner of Police.
Yeah. Now, you were also on the show a few months ago to talk about the ZOSOs. You advocated heavily for the zones of special operations. Now, can you explain the thinking then, or remind us of the thinking then that you had explained to us behind that approach and the role that it would have played in effectively tackling crime?
Well, the thing is, they say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we looked at the Jamaican model, and the bill we presented into Parliament was in large part or virtually identical to the Jamaican position. Our constitutions are largely similar. Our socio-economic systems and cultures are somewhat similar, not identical. But we felt that given the progress that the Jamaicans had made, and when you examine the two parts, first of all, the first phase would be what they call the shock and awe, where you go in and you have a targeted approach to, in essence, remove those who control certain pockets in this country. The gang leaders, the drug barons, the shooters, and so on. You remove them because they, in essence, control certain communities in this country. And then at that point, you were a better place to have a targeted approach, because there are many communities in this country, you'd be surprised, where children do not go to school. They don't have books. They don't have the necessities. So we felt that in order to save these communities, and some of these communities fall prey to the gang leaders and so on, because the gang leaders are providing for them, so their loyalty would be to the gang leaders. And we felt that in order to address the proximal causes of crime in the short term, quite apart from removing guns, securing the borders so that guns and drugs don't come in, which we, in essence, you've seen the success with the recent interdiction, with the kidnapping and so on from San Juan. We've had a great degree of success in terms of securing the borders and preventing guns from coming in. But the other part of the criminal industry, you have to stifle the human resource aspect. You have to stifle that part which the gangs keep having members, new members, recruiting new members, and so on. So we felt that what was needed was a targeted approach in terms of removing the miscreants, but at the same time ensuring that there is social justice and economic justice for those in certain communities, to ensure that they have the same access to the same opportunities and the same resources, so that they have a better chance of advancing academically and otherwise.
I want to shift a little bit now to Tobago affairs. You met recently with Tobago House of Assembly Chief Secretary, Mr. Augustine. How important was that engagement when you met with him, and what has it meant for strengthening security in Tobago, particularly? When
we met with the Chief Sec in Tobago, that was during the height of the THA elections. So there were quite a number of concerns about the presence of the radar. So in essence, not just out of courtesy, but because he is a valuable partner, not just politically, in many other ways. And Tobago, of course, is part of Trinidad. We had to, in essence, tell him as much as we felt he needed to know. There wasn't much we didn't explain to him about the presence of the radar, why we needed it, where the shortcomings were, because there were blind spots, or dead zones, you would call it, in the radar. And it was amazing that the dead zones were in Carly Bay, Claxton Bay, Toco, and part of Tobago. And we knew that this is where the drop-offs were, and that's where the guns and the drugs were coming in. And because we had some issues with our own radar, we needed that radar to, in essence, give us some time to upgrade and to fix our own issues. So I think he, in essence, once he had full disclosure, he was on board.
Yeah. Now, we spoke earlier when I introduced you, about the influence of international help as well for us in Trinidad and Tobago. And you actually represented Trinidad and Tobago at the America's Counter Cartel Conference. Now, what did that moment mean for you, and how important is that level of international engagement, especially for your for national security and what you continue to strive for?
What it meant for me, it provided us with an opportunity to speak with our partners who were basically had the same agenda, and to speak directly with them. Now, what you saw on the television was just a small part of it. The rest of the day was spent in what they referred to as breakout sessions, where we had smaller groups meeting with. We met with the Secretary of War. We met with Steve Miller, and I can't remember if it was Eldridge Colby, but we had some intense meetings where we were able to talk openly, discuss with them what our challenges were, and to make requests, so that we had a, in essence, targeted approach as to how we intended to do our part on this end, so that the benefits would redound not just to us, but to many of our other partners, particularly the United States.
You also made a call for greater collaboration with the U.S. in the area of tackling drug trafficking. So how has that partnership supported border security efforts in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, where we were in essence compromised, and I'll tell you now, when we came into government shortly after, only 3 of our 60 naval assets were functional. And believe it or not, none of the weapons affixed to those naval assets worked. So the Venezuelans could have walked in here with cutlasses and invade us. So we had to, in essence, try to get some sort of partnership where we have another entity with the resources, police the borders. And as you see what is happening with the kinetic strikes and so on, they have their own views, they have their own laws. Before that, I believe it was Congress or the United States president had, in essence, declared drug cartels as narco-terrorists. So their law was, if they are terrorists, we could pursue them wherever and with whatever means necessary and so on. So they have their own perspective. But their actions on the seas, in essence, it has redounded to our benefits, because you've seen the reduction in terms of the inflow and so on. So that partnership has worked. It continues to work. In fact, just a week or 2 ago, I met with the MLO Captain Tech and a team from Southcom. And very shortly now, we are not down to 3 vessels anymore. It's much more than that. But we are, in short order, we're getting more assets to assist us. And we continue to share intelligence in terms of surveillance and communications and so on. They also very early assisted us in fixing a communication problem we had. So whilst the radar center had dead zones and so on, where there were actual zones that were operational, imagine the radar center having to call CDROS by cell phone. And by the time someone picks up, the persons who came in with the boat, they were already ashore, offloaded and ready to leave. So that we were not getting a lot of success because the communications, equipment which we acquired so many years ago, they simply did not work. The U.S. assisted us in getting them back up to strength, and now the communication systems are better, the surveillance systems are better.
Yeah, so speaking about partnerships as well, I know you've also engaged with countries like Colombia and Japan. So how are those relationships also strengthening Trinidad and Tobago's national security framework?
Well, those are just 2 of the countries. We also met with Turkey and a few other countries. The partnership was with Turkey in particular. We were looking to purchase some unmanned drone boats, they call them, armed drone boats. The cost is a bit prohibitive, but they are trying to facilitate us in other ways. The U.S. is providing other types of equipment, so that might, the request from Turkey might be OTOs. Turkey is also helping us to align with some providers who provide state-of-the-art technology in terms of container terminal examinations and so on, much better than we've had. And because it's public knowledge that the bulk of the illegal firearms come through legal ports of entry. So that's a challenge we had. In terms of Japan indicated to us how they could help. And one of the things we really worked with the Japanese, but we are unable to go much further. We were seeking to use their technology, the advances they had in terms of search and rescue, to retrieve the body of a sailor who had died in I think it was January or February last year, and we were seeking to retrieve the body. We exhausted all avenues. We've not had much success, but we continue. The U.S. they've indicated what assistance they can give, and we'll make an attempt again.
Now, you've spoken a few times in just a few seconds ago about the progress in the fight against drugs and illegal firearms. So can you tell us what gains have been made so far, especially with the enhanced surveillance?
Well, with the enhanced surveillance, of course, you see how difficult it is to get drugs and guns into Trinidad and Tobago. That's one. But, I mean, the evidence is there. Look at the reverse. There was a kidnapping here. That one was widespread, had a lot of coverage. A kidnapping that took place in San Juan. And in a very short time, we were able to put together our assets and interdict at sea. So that is indicative of how far we've come from, because from 2016 upwards, you would have seen videos where the Coast Guard assets, the vessels, there was an entire graveyard of vessels. And what we've done in the interim, quite apart from relying on our partners, we've sought to upgrade some of our assets. And we found a situation where the damning vessels, they were not being used in the way they were intended. And that was the cause of many of the vessels falling into disuse. Because there was an onboard generator which was really supplemental. And the last regime, I don't know if they had this agenda to ensure that the damning vessels failed and make the UNC government from 2010 to 15 look bad. But the manufacturers indicated that if you are using these vessels, you should have an electrical shore supply, and that's what you should use. And the generator should only be used when power is low. What the previous regime did, they did not install the shore supply, electrical shore supply, but they used the generators so that the vessels, we didn't get the best out of the vessels, it shortened the shelf life and so on. We, in essence, we sent those vessels to Suriname to dry dock and to repair, and they are now back up, 2 of them are now back up and running. So we've increased our fleet, not just by 2, but I can tell you, there's a limit to what I can tell you.
Yeah, I want to shift gears just a little bit now to talk about bail reform. That's something you've discussed time and time again, and measures targeting those repeat offenders, those legislative efforts. How do these support a stronger security and justice system?
The bail provisions we implemented, in essence, targeted 2 things. First of all, there was a lacuna in the 2024 legislation, which there was a collaborative effort, but there was an issue raised by Saddam Hussein, and it was not addressed by Reginald Armour or any of the other PNM lawyers, and there were about 8, 3 or 4 of them senior counsel in the parliament. It flew over their heads, and only when we got to the courts, then we saw the decisions exposing the lacuna. So the first thing we had to do was fix that. That lacuna related to the entitlement to bail as of right, once a certain amount of time had passed, where the trial had either not yet started or had started and not been completed. Then you were entitled to bail without having to show exceptional circumstances. The other portion of that bail amendment dealt with using the bail system for money laundering exercises, so that the criminal element was able to launder its illegal money through the criminal justice system. That has been fixed. In terms of legislative reforms, the other part which we passed recently was the Probation of Offenders Act, amendments to the Act. And it's, in essence, twofold. When you're dealing with punishment, there are two parts, two things you have to have in mind. One, you have to punish, but two, you also have to keep in mind that there should be some aspect of rehabilitation. And the bill starts off with one of the clauses where, in lieu of imprisonment, instead of sending persons to prison, you can put them on probation. So you have the threat of imprisonment hanging over their heads, and you attach certain conditions to their probation. The court will determine which orders, whether it's a curfew, restricting them from membership in gangs or restricting them from going to certain areas. It's a whole slew of issues. And if they successfully complete that aspect, that time frame, without offending, breaching the conditions or committing further offenses, then they never go to prison. So in essence, that's a second chance. And you have to keep in mind that 98% of these persons who go to prison will at some point return to society. So we can't simply focus on the punitive aspect, knowing fully well that invariably they are going to be released back into society. So the other part is, quite apart from what I just said about in lieu of sentence, the other part is where you are actually sentenced, so that there's a term imprisonment imposed upon you. Then toward the end of your imprisonment, there's a probationary part of it, so that you get to be released on probation. And when you are released on probation, you are released on terms, so that you do not commit offenses, you do not violate conditions of the order set by the court, whether it's the same curfew or using drugs or whatever. And it also has a rehabilitative aspect, that you sign up for employment and certain courses and so on, so that you get to be released early with the threat of imprisonment hanging over your head. If you violate, then you go back to prison. If you don't, then it in essence channels you into the right direction.
Well, Minister, before we wrap up, there's so much more we can talk about for your past year and everything you've accomplished. But as you now reflect on the past year, what achievements are you most proud of?
The 42% reduction in crime, and it started very early. With Roger and I and the National Security Council, in essence, brainstorming about how we are going to achieve this. As I said earlier, you can't stop people from killing their wives and so on. Crimes of passion. That's to fix that. That's a long-term thing that deals with mindset and culture and things like that. But people want to see results in the short term. People want relief in the short term, and we figure that one part of it is stopping the ability of those on the inside from carrying out hits on the outside. You've seen how that has impacted. We've also had targeted measures, and ZOSO would have helped with that. ZOSO is just one piece, but it was an important first step before we implemented other things. And it would have allowed us, you wouldn't have needed a state of emergency. It would have allowed us to target certain communities and, if necessary, establish a cordon or, in essence, have a curfew, so that we have a very targeted operation, so that we root out, we search, we extract. We also have to, in the short term, come back to Parliament to fix aspects of the anti-gang legislation. But we are brainstorming on a lot of other issues, knowing that we don't have ZOSO at this point. But I think to answer your question directly, the reduction in crime, the 42% reduction in murders, and the reduction in violent crime generally, that's one of the highlights.
Thank you, Minister. We know there's a lot more work to do, and we expect great things coming out of the Defence Ministry. Thank you very much for being here, and congratulations again on your first year in office. Well, we get ready to take a short break and come back. That was Defence Minister Wayne Sturge joining us on Trinidad and Tobago today.